Hi, I'm Swizets and this is Shoutem's React Native School. Today we're building an Imgur client. The Imgur app we're building is designed to make imagery more fun. Images are full screen, and if you tap on the right side you go to the next image, and when you hit an album you can scroll up and down to see the whole thing. And then when you rotate the screen, the images get even bigger. In this tutorial you're going to learn MobX, fetching from RESTful APIs, ListView, device orientation. Also, I think I need a bigger pen. We'll start with rendering one full screen image, and I'm going to be copy pasting code so you don't have to watch me code from scratch. If you do want to watch me code from scratch, you should check out my live coding channel. First, we need a TouchableImage component that handles everything about a single image. Renders the image, handles touching left and right, and handles any sort of full screening that happens when you rotate the screen. TouchableImage component is going to be pretty much the same as what we had in the previous example, so I'm going to copy paste it over and show you the differences later on. Create a new touchable image component file, and then I'm going to copy paste it all straight from GitHub from the example that's already done. Okay, so we have the TouchableImage component with a render method that looks pretty similar to what you saw in the previous React Native 101 example. We have a touchable highlight that gets touches, and then an image that renders an image with some styling and a caption. When somebody presses the image, we get we go into the onPress callback, check whether we clicked left or right, and then call the correct action on our data store. And I'll show you how the data store works in just a bit when we get something rendering first. Great. Now that we have the TouchableImage component, we need an Imgur carousel. We need an Imgur carousel component, which eventually is going to decide between rendering an album or a single image. But for now, it just needs to render an image or a spinner if the image is still loading. So the Imgur carousel is going to be our main component, essentially. The reason we're not putting all of this straight into index.ios.js is because it can technically be shared between both iOS and Android. Before we do any rendering, we should also make sure that we have our styles. They go into a styles file that contains essentially a style sheet for all of our components, and the reason we put it in a separate file instead of at the bottom like you have in the default React Native app is because this makes it easier to share between different components and different files. I'm not going to go into the details of all the different styles because that would be kind of silly, so here's just the important part. We have a portrait and a landscape class where for portrait we make sure that images are contained. Basically, we want to see the entire image, and for landscape, we want the image to cover the entire screen. Okay, now it's time to go back into our index file and make sure that we're rendering the Imgur carousel component. Before this renders, we have to do two more things: detect device orientation and create a MobX store that's actually going to drive all the callbacks and some of the state stuff that we already saw in TouchableImage. The best way I found to detect device orientation is to use the onLayout callback from our container view. This gets called every time that the dimensions of our view change, which means that it should get called when we rotate the screen. Inside the callback, we just check for whether width is bigger than height, and if it is, then our orientation is landscape, otherwise it's portrait. And with that, it's time to implement our MobX store, which again, I'm just gonna copy paste. I mean, look at all this code. You don't want to see me write all of that from scratch, do you? Don't be silly. Okay, here's how the store works. We have a class called store, and you can essentially turn any ES6 class into a MobX store with adding some observables. Observables are properties that are observable. The way MobX does it is that we have this @ syntax in front, which is an ES6 decorator. So each observable gets a pair of getters and setters. MobX uses those to detect when we change a property so that it can subscribe observers to its changes. We change those properties using actions. Each action is a method that changes the value of an observable. So for instance, change orientation changes orientation to a new orientation. The reason we have to wrap those methods with an action decorator is so that MobX can help us with debugging by making lists of changes through actions, and it also makes it easier to see which methods are changing state. One last thing before we can run this is to add the constants file where we define basically just portrait and landscape. A constants file makes it easier to share constants between different files, and yes, that's my Imgur Client ID, and I hope you don't use it, especially if you're doing something shady. You can get your own Imgur ID by going to api.imgur.com and registering your application. You don't need this yet, but you will need it later when we start talking to the Imgur API. Now, before we can use our store, we have to make sure that all of our components have access to it. We do that using a MobX provider, which copies its properties into React context, and that gives everything access to the same store. To use the provider, we have to wrap our entire app in MobX provider with a store instance. Now that we've done this, we'll be able to use @inject anywhere in our app to get access to the MobX store, which will let us trigger actions, access state, and all of those good things. Oh, and one more thing is to add the spinner component, which shows a beating heart. In the article down there, I did this last, so that's why I forgot about it. The spinner is a simple component that returns a view that goes full screen and centers the image, and then loads a local image that looks like this. It doesn't actually animate in Emacs, but in the app it will. Our app now renders a beating heart, which looks kind of weird because it has a black border and the background isn't black. We can fix that in index.js by changing the background color to black, and I know that for future compatibility we have to remove these justify contents here, which moves the beating heart, but I know it worked before. Now, how do we render an actual image so that we can see that the orientation stuff is working? The easiest way is to go into Imgur carousel, see that we're using store.currentImage to give an image to TouchableImage, then go into store, find getCurrentImage, and replacing it with something static, like this octopi fact from Imgur. We have to make sure that we're using HTTPS, and then we do link and title. This is an octopus, and that should render an image right here. Interesting, the styling is all off. Aha, it was because of stuff from the future. TouchableImage needs a height so that it can adjust when it's rendered in a ListView, and that comes when we're doing albums. But for now, if we use store screen size height, you can see that the image kind of adjusts its resizing algorithm based on the orientation. Right, we have an image. Let's start fetching things from Imgur and make this actually interesting. Talking to the Imgur API happens in store.js, basically in these two actions. We have a fetch images action, which goes to gallery hot viral and the current gallery page. Then it throws any errors that happen, parses the return JSON, and then goes through each item in the data array and pushes it to our images, to our local images array. And if there's an error, it prints it out. Similarly for an album, it fetches a specific album, then sets its data on the local state. The state that we're changing is at the top of our store. We have an observable images array, which starts as empty. We have an index, which points at the first image at first, the current gallery page, and I think it loads like 60 images per page, so we only iterate on this every once in a while. And then we have an albums hash map, which we need so that we can avoid loading the same albums twice. Another important part are the previous image and next image actions, which essentially just change the current index. When we're going previous image, we change the index to by -1, and if it's less than 1, we change it back to 0, and for next image we go up, and if we hit the end of the current images list, we increase the gallery page and trigger fetch images again. We have to trigger the first fetch image in index.js when our app first opens. We put store fetch images in component will mount. I guess now we need the album component, which renders images in a list view. Once again, I'm copy pasting from the GitHub repository, and you can check the details downstairs. Don't worry, I'm gonna explain how it works here as well. The component comes basically in 3 parts. First, fetching the albums. Second, setting up the data source for our list view. And third, rendering in 3 different render functions. To fetch an album, we use component will mount or component will receive props so that we do store fetch album with a new album ID whenever it updates. Because ListView renders from a data source instead of just a normal JavaScript array, we have to use 2 different functions to generate this data source. Well, we don't actually have to use 2 different functions, but it's easier if we use 2 because some of the code is shared with other stuff. The important part is this getDataSource function. It generates a new ListView data source, which gets a rowHasChange comparator. I'm not exactly sure why, but it needs it. And we use data source clone with row to populate the data source with our data. And honestly, I have no idea why it has to be this way, but the result is that ListView gives us automatically gives us scrolling, inertial scrolling, and it only renders the components that are actually visible on screen, which helps with performance. For rendering, we use 3 different functions. Render row, which renders each particular row with a touchable image. Render header, which renders a text with slightly bigger fonts. And the main render method, which renders our actual list view. It first checks if the album is actually loaded yet, and if it's not, it renders a spinner. Then if it is loaded, it renders a view with a list view that gets our render row function, gets a render header, and some styling. If we just have one image in the album, we just return the normal render row component. Right, so what makes our list view rows actually full screen? It's the height thing that I mentioned earlier when we were playing around with TouchableImage. Inside render row, we get the height of the screen that's currently in store. And if the image is smaller than the height, then we use the image's height. Otherwise, we use the screen size to define how big the image should render for each row. Okay, so when we enable this stuff back in Imgur carousel, we should see a working Imgur app. But it's not working because I did something wrong. Aha! It was the import album stuff. When album is not defined, things don't work. And now we have a working app. And yeah, it looks kind of weird because for some reason when I was copy pasting things, I did something wrong. But I promise you that the app works if you look at the complete Imgur app on GitHub. See, I told you that it works. I have no idea what went wrong when I was copy pasting, but the real app has proper scaling and things render where they're supposed to. So that's the Imgur app. Today we learned about MobX, fetching from APIs, ListView, and detecting device orientation. If you want to read about all of those in more detail, you should check the article down there. And if you like this kind of stuff, you should subscribe by email so you get the next lesson in about 2 weeks.